PK in the universe, here to talk about, are you using retro right? Yes, I'm going to talk about the differences between retro, old, vintage, and antique. Well, first up, what does retro actually mean? Because it's a term that gets used a lot, and I'm somebody who talks to a lot of people who play old school video games. So the topic of retro and what is retro comes up a lot. Well, retro means literally something that's aesthetically old, but is typically modern or contemporary. So if something has to kind of be new to be retro. Let's talk about, well, what is old? Old literally just can mean anything. Anything can be old, but typically if something isn't vintage and if something isn't retro or modern, then it's old, just simply. So my PS3, it came out in 2006, it's old. Whereas something that came out 20 years ago, over 20 years ago, like my NES, is vintage. Or even the Dreamcast, which literally just hit the 20th birthday not too long ago. That's considered vintage. And something that's an antique is over 100 years old. So those are actually the meanings of these words. So oftentimes I hear people confuse and retro with vintage or old. Now, so a good example, let's use Mega Man 2 as our example. Mega Man 2 on the NES is vintage. It's an old game from over 20 years ago. Whereas Mega Man 2 played on my PS4 through the Mega Man Legacy Collection, that's retro. You're literally playing an old game on a modern or contemporary console. Another example, the NES versus the NES Classic. Which one is retro? You guessed it. The NES Classic is retro because it's literally, contemporarily made. It's modern. It has HDMI. Has a user interface that's very modern. Whereas the NES is vintage. It's an old console. It plays old games. It's vintage. Another good example. I have two Monopoly games. One is from the 1960s, and the other is from 2015, and is part of the retro series made to look like the 1935 style Monopoly. Obviously, it's pretty obvious which one is retro in that, literally the one that says retro on it. Now, what about gamers themselves? A lot of people like to call themselves retro gamers. And, I'm sure I have friends who in the gaming community have retro in their name. I used to have retro in my name. I used to be called PK's Retro Reviews. But what is retro? And the answer is, yes, everybody's a retro gamer, quite honestly, because very few people play video games in a purely modern vacuum or a purely vintage vacuum. I don't think there's very many people that don't play games that call back to a certain type of game. I mean, maybe if you go, I'm a modern gamer, but I play Shovel Knight. Well, that's retro gaming at its finest because it's literally a new game or newer game that calls back to a different time. Very few people are purely vintage gamers. Very few people are only playing exclusively old games on old TVs that they were intended for, though they do exist, but there's very few of them. And I bet a lot of those people also delve into modern gaming too, So there's very few people who are purely vintage gamers. Most people, for the most part, are retro gamers. So that's my thoughts on the words retro gaming. Now, after watching all this and listening to me babble on about all this stuff, you're probably asking yourself, am I advocating or calling people to action to start using retro right? The answer is no. Honestly, I actually encourage you people to continue to use retro the way you've always been using it, just to simply mean old. Because if enough people use this term this way, eventually it will become the new definition and new meaning, because that's what happens to words. Words evolve and change over time, and eventually they develop new meanings. Heck, the term vintage alone used to be in reference only to wine, and now it's become in reference to things older than 20 years old. So yes, that's why I wanted to make this video, is because I wanted to make people self-aware of the term retro being misused, but I also wanted to encourage people to continue to using it the way they've always been using. So anyways, that's my thoughts on retro and the different definitions of old things and what old things mean. Anyways, thank you guys so much for watching. If you're new here, subscribe, comment below regardless of how long you've been here. I'd love to hear what you have to say. Thank you so much for watching, and stay awesome in this universe. Thanks. Bye.